Hello everyone, welcome back to another Project Gladiator weather forecast. Today I'm going to be covering the weather for May 31st of 2023. What we're currently looking at is a slight risk setup on the Texas-New Mexican border. We've been seeing a lot of this type of setup recently, as well as a marginal threat extending all the way from deep southwestern South Dakota all the way to Big Bend country of Texas. As for our threats, we do have a 5% coming a day early. That low pressure system is pulling up the jet stream just a day early with a 5% on top of a 2%. As for our wind threat, we have a 15% with a hatch significant threat in the Texas area on top of a 5% for the rest of the marginal threat. As for our hail threat, we do have a 15% with a hatch significant threat on the New Mexican side with a overall 5% threat. Taking a look at our pivotal weather models, starting off with 500 millibars in the jet stream, we can see that this low pressure system that I covered on the weekly overlook, which is going to bring the possibility of some sufficient wind shear the next few days to the New Mexican and Texas area. This is expected to continue moving eastward, as well as this little impulse right here. This is going to help provide the possibility of some sufficient wind shear to the area and help trigger the possibility of some tornadoes, as well as overall trigger the possibility of some severe weather development. For the rest of the marginal threat, storm development is mostly going to be reliant on weak lead troughing throughout much of the area. Taking a look at our dew points here, mostly focusing on the slight risk area, you can notice that dew points aren't really as strong as we would have anticipated. They are mostly in the mid to upper 50s, not so much in the 60s really. With whatever strong lapse rates, these weaker dew points are mostly going to keep Cape values in this area, likely going to keep Cape values mostly in the moderates in the 1,000 to 2,000 range. Taking a look at lapse rates, you can see starting off there is really strong and very steep lapse rates, which is going to help enhance our Cape, especially in the slight risk area. You can see at the start of the run, you can see that there are values that are in the 9s and 8s. But around the time that storm development starts, lapse rates are have decreased a little bit to the 8s, but still in the 9s. So this is going to help bring a lot of instability. However, our dew points again are likely going to inhibit our the Cape values a little bit, not allow them to get up as high as they normally could. Again, keeping them mostly around the 1,000s to 2,000s range. Taking a look at Cape values, you can see around the time storms start to develop, you can see that the Cape values are pretty much what I predicted. They are mostly in the 1,000s to weak 2,000 range, but then we also have this patch of stronger instability in the Texas Panhandle. This will come into play later on in the afternoon, in the very late morning of tomorrow. Around storm development time in New Mexico, Cape does look like it checks out for the possibility of tornadoes in the New Mexico area, as well as the possibility of some strong damaging wind gusts and large hail. But then by the time it reaches Texas, it does track through some weaker instability, especially further down south. But then around the time it gets through central Texas Panhandle, into that larger patch of instability. This larger patch of instability should allow, again, for the possibility of some possibly larger hail than what we saw in New Mexico in the very late morning hours of tomorrow. But overall, Cape does look like it checks out for tornadic development. Taking a look at our wind shear, again focusing on the 5% tornado threat, you can see around the time storms begin to develop, storms are likely going to be more in a discrete and isolated supercell development mode instead of an outflow-dominated linear mode. So this wind shear should be available for strong tornadic development in the possibility of tornadoes, as well as with that weaker moderate Cape, probably keeping it down to more of a 5% tornado threat, as well as this wind shear being mostly in the 30 to 40 knots in some areas. Relatively weaker wind shear, but still definitely sufficient wind shear for a marginal tornado threat. But then by the time it gets into Texas, storms are likely going to merge into more of an outflow dominated linear mode. Any wind shear behind it is not going to be usable for tornadic development. But then around central Texas, the central Texas Panhandle area, stronger wind shear does develop overall. So with that stronger area for Cape in that small little patch that I talked about, as well as this 30 knot to 25 knot wind shear patch, there could be the possibility of some embedded tornadoes or embedded supercell rotation developing, but overall, anywhere outside of that, tornadoes are likely going to not be a possibility, but there could definitely still be the possibility with this weaker wind shear and weaker Cape values for the possibility of some embedded weak rotation, but again, likely not any tornadic development. Taking a look at composite reflectivity so you guys can get a better idea of the differences between outflow dominated linear mode and isolated discrete storm cells. Around storm development time in New Mexico, you can see individual cells here. Each one of these patches of increased reflectivity are going to be your rotating supercells and your isolated tornadic supercells. So any wind shear present at this time is going to be usable for tornadic development because it is not outflow dominated. So it doesn't have to be ahead of the storm system for it to be used. Any wind shear present could be used for storm development. But then by the time it reaches Texas, storms merge into more of a line with increased reflectivity along the outflow boundary. This is where it's mostly outflow dominated. So any wind shear ahead of this line is going to be usable for tornadic development, and it has to be ahead of the line. Any wind shear behind that is mostly going to be a developed wind shear or wind shear left in the wake of storm development. But again, wind shear has to be ahead of that line for tornadic development. But because wind shear is so weak ahead of the outflow line in Texas, tornadoes are likely not going to be possible. But the very weak wind shear and weaker Cape should allow for the possibility of some weak rotation, but tornadoes are not likely. But again, keep in mind that patch of instability around this area. And some somewhat weaker wind shear could allow for the possibility of some weak rotation and possibly a funnel cloud and maybe a brief tornado in the early morning hours of tomorrow. Now that I've told you the weather, please go down to the description and check out the socials for Project Gladiator and join the Discord for any updates on Project Gladiator, and hopefully I will see you guys tomorrow with another forecast.